exactly 18 months after Julian Sterling took the luxury Gold Coast penthouse, the customized Porsche, and primary custody of their 9-year-old daughter, Maeve Jenkins stood in the freezing wind outside a West Side warehouse with $412.18 left in her savings account. She was wearing her late grandmother's faded woolen coat, her fingers raw from hand-stitching 40-pound rolls of raw denim in a basement that smelled of rust and damp concrete. 12 months later, she stood under the blinding, white-hot spotlight of the main stage at New York Fashion Week. Julian was watching from his front-row VIP seat. He was not ready for what he saw. 6 a.m. Hot steam and cold wind. Maeve stood behind a massive oak cutting table with a pair of heavy rusted 1968 steel shears and a soft dark brown leather notebook. She had never planned to build a commercial empire. She designed because the rhythm of thread passing through fabric was the only heartbeat her hands understood. Maeve grew up on East 47th Street in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago, in a brick brownstone that smelled of pressed cotton, dried lavender, and the sharp, warm scent of hot starch. The brownstone belonged to her grandmother, Hattie Jenkins, born 1943, who lived in that house for 48 years and ran a makeshift tailoring shop from her dining room. Hattie sewed for the local choir. She sewed for the neighborhood brides. She sewed for any young woman who needed a dress hemmed for a job interview, but could not afford the downtown prices. She never demanded contracts. She never turned a soul away. On Friday evenings, she prepared a pot of tea, laid out 3 boxes of buttons on the porch table, and whoever needed their clothes repaired simply sat down. She kept a design journal. It was bound in soft, hand-treated sheepskin, dark brown and worn smooth at the corners by years of touch. 184 pages. 31 years of community history, recorded 1 stitch, 1 fabric swatch, 1 pattern adjustment at a time. Notes crowded the margins, written in faded blue ink in Hattie's precise, slanted script. Do not rush the bias cut. Let the silk breath before you pin it. Trust the weight of the drape. Maeve was beside her in that sunlit room from the moment she was tall enough to stand on a footstool and look over the edge of the ironboard. A 5-year-old girl holding a wooden ruler that was far too long for her arm. Hattie did not give her scraps just to keep her quiet. She gave her real work. Align this grain line, pin this hem, tell me if this shoulder sits true. By the time Maeve was 12, she could draft a sleeve pattern from memory. By 15, she was tailoring the Sunday suits for the church deacons, while Hattie sat by the window in her rocking chair, watching with quiet eyes. Hattie taught Maeve how to match the weave of wool, but she also taught her something else, something that had nothing to do with measurements, chalk lines, or steam irons. You dress a person and you look them in the eyes. That is how you tell them they have dignity. Maeve heard that sentence more times than she could count. She heard it when she was 9, again when she was 19, and on the quiet morning she packed her bags to study design in New York. Maeve left Chicago at 21, armed with a scholarship to Parsons, graduating top of her class before landing an entry-level position at a mid-tier fashion house on 7th Avenue. She worked 90-hour weeks without a whisper of complaint. The morning she left Bronzeville, Hattie placed 2 objects in her hands: the sheepskin design journal and a small black and white photograph. It was Hattie standing in front of her dining room workshop in 1972, 29 years old, wearing a simple linen apron, her hands holding a tape measure, smiling as if she knew a secret the rest of the world was still trying to figure out. Maeve carried both for 17 years. The journal occupied the center shelf of every cramped apartment she rented. She opened it constantly during her early years in New York, then less frequently, and then not at all after Hattie fell ill. Hattie Jenkins died on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 years before this story begins, 80 years old, in the same bedroom 12 feet from the dining table, where she had clothed her community for decades. Maeve flew back to Chicago for the service. She sat in that quiet dining room for 3 hours after the mourners departed. She did not touch the fabric. She did not open the sheepskin journal. She sat at the empty table, staring at the old black Singer machine and the steel shears hanging from the pegboard by the window. She returned to her life the following morning. She placed the journal on the top shelf of her new closet in Chicago. She did not open it again, not once in 4 years, not once until the night her entire world was stripped down to the bone. She did not know it then. She did not know that the hand-drawn patterns in that book and the photograph of the woman in the linen apron would become her only shield against utter ruin. She would learn this, but not yet. Maeve met Julian Sterling when she was 26. He was 29, an ambitious brand manager for a luxury retail group in downtown Chicago. He wore bespoke charcoal suits, spoke with a smooth, calculated cadence, and remembered the exact name of the obscure textile mill she had mentioned in passing weeks ago. He had a spreadsheet for every dream. That was what drew her in. Julian always knew the path forward. They married when Maeve was 28 in a quiet, elegant ceremony with 30 guests. Maeve designed and hand-sewed her own wedding gown because she wanted the fabric to tell their story, and because Julian said it would save them $6,000 that they could invest in his new venture. He was right. It was practical. It was also the first quiet step in a pattern she would not fully comprehend for over a decade. They had one daughter, Maya, born when Maeve was 29. Maeve stopped working her corporate design job when Maya was born. Julian suggested it during a quiet dinner on the Gold Coast. You do not need to burn yourself out for other brands. I have got our future secured, she agreed. It made logical sense. Private childcare cost more than her salary at the time. Julian's new luxury label, Sterling & Co., was growing. She would stay home, raise their daughter, manage their household, and quietly draft the patterns that made his brand look elite. 2 years later, Julian suggested he take complete control of the family assets. You focus on the creative side, and Maya. I will handle the corporate structures and investments. She agreed. It made sense. Julian understood the mechanics of venture capital. He worked with international logistics every day. She trusted him completely. There was no reason to doubt her husband. 3 years after that, Julian said the Gold Coast penthouse mortgage should be solely in his name. A mere administrative technicality. The bank offers a significantly lower interest rate with a single high-earning borrower. She signed the documents on the kitchen island. She did not read the dense, single-spaced pages. She did not ask hard questions. That is what you do when you build a life with someone. You sign, you trust, you go back to stitching the samples. Julian was a master of the corporate narrative. In front of investors, he was the devoted family man. In front of the fashion editors, he was the visionary creative director. In front of their daughter, he was the father who curated weekend gallery visits. Maeve designed every single garment for the launch collections of Sterling & Co. She selected the silk, drafted the blocks, and spent 48 hours straight hand-draping the signature trench coats that the Chicago Tribune praised for weeks. She packed the trunks. She supervised the fittings. Julian introduced her to socialites as my beautiful wife, while the designs appeared on the runway as if they had materialized from his own mind. He never once publicly credited her hand. He used phrases like, "We executed a refined aesthetic," or "the collection came together beautifully," before steering the conversation back to his business model. Every major relationship Sterling & Co., built in Chicago, was anchored by a garment Maeve had drafted. Every investor presentation, every elite trunk show, every private fitting where Julian invited a high-net-worth client to their penthouse required Maeve to spend 18 hours in her home studio. Her hands built the literal material of his wealthy lifestyle. Her name was on absolutely none of it. Not on the corporate bank accounts, not on the trademark registrations, not on the design patents, not on the penthouse deed, not on the luxury vehicle titles. 12 years of drafting, draping, raising their daughter, and managing every detail of their public life, and her signature did not appear on a single asset that held value. She did not notice the shift. That is the nature of systemic control when it is executed with patience. You do not feel the floor sloping beneath your feet. You simply wake up one morning and find yourself standing on a precipice, with nothing but air beneath you. Julian began coordinating the divorce 16 months before Maeve discovered a single crack in their marriage. He retained Lawrence Vance, 55 years old, a ruthless asset protection attorney with an office overlooking the Chicago River. Vance did not negotiate settlements. He built legal fortresses. Julian did not want an amicable separation. He wanted a total erasure. In the spring of the year before the papers were delivered, Vance restructured the mortgage on the Gold Coast penthouse. The property Maeve had called home for 11 years went through a complex refinancing that transferred the title into an offshore-owned limited liability company controlled solely by Julian. Julian brought the documents home on a rainy Tuesday evening. He laid them on the marble island, while Maeve was finishing a sketch. He said the firm was consolidating its real estate holdings for tax efficiency. He said it would reduce their annual property tax liability by $9,000. He told her she only needed to sign the final authorization pages. She signed. She remembered the cold weight of the metal pen. She did not remember anyone explaining that she was signing away her right to her home. In the summer, Vance moved their joint savings. $83,000 was transferred to a private wealth account in the Cayman Islands. The monthly physical statements stopped arriving at the penthouse. Maeve did not notice because she had not looked at a paper bank statement in 7 years. Julian managed the accounts. That was the foundation of their agreement. In the autumn, the primary intellectual property of Sterling & Co. The designs Maeve had drafted from her grandmother's old techniques was legally assigned to a parent holding company with Julian listed as the individual owner. In the winter, the title of the luxury SUV she used to drive Maya to school was transferred, Julian's name only. In the spring, her corporate credit cards were quietly canceled. Julian claimed there had been a security breach and that the bank was issuing new cards. The new cards arrived. Maeve never saw them. 16 months, 9 legal documents, every single one signed or processed while Maeve sketched new patterns, helped Maya with her 4th grade science project, and trusted the man who slept beside her every night. The divorce petition arrived on a dry afternoon in November. Maeve was standing in her home studio. She had just finished pinning a silk muslin. She was holding a pair of dressmaker's pins between her lips. Julian set the heavy linen envelope on the cutting table, right next to her grandmother's old sheepskin journal. She spat the pins into a magnetic dish. She opened the envelope. She read the first page. She did not sit down. She stood and read all 34 pages to the very end. Then she placed them back on the table, exactly where Julian had laid them. She did not cry. Julian was standing by the glass doors of the terrace. He had been studying her face. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them uttered a word. The temporary custody hearing took exactly 4 weeks. Julian's legal team moved with absolute precision because they had been preparing the ground for over a year. Vance filed for temporary primary custody of Maya. His argument was clinical and devastating. Maeve had 0 independent income. Maeve had no individual bank accounts in the United States. Maeve had no official employment history for the past 10 years. Maeve had no assets in her name. Maeve had no established credit score. On paper, Maeve Jenkins did not exist. Vance presented tax returns showing Julian as the sole economic provider of the family. He presented the penthouse deed held by the corporate entity. He presented the liquid accounts in Julian's name. He presented a stable luxury environment with a private nanny, a dedicated tutor, and a father earning $380,000 a year. The family court judge, citing the child's established lifestyle and the mother's lack of immediate financial stability, granted Julian temporary primary custody of Maya pending the final divorce trial. Temporary. But to Maeve, the word sounded like a heavy iron gate slamming shut. She packed one leather suitcase. She took her basic clothing. She took her grandmother's sheepskin journal from the shelf. She took the rusted steel shears. There was exactly $412.18 left in an old checking account she had opened during her first year in New York. A small account Julian and Vance had overlooked because it was registered under her maiden name and had remained dormant for a decade. $412. The one thread they failed to cut. She walked out of the Gold Coast penthouse on a freezing Friday morning. 11 years in that space, the massive drafting table where she had spent thousands of hours, the kitchen island where she made pancakes with Maya on Sunday mornings, the studio floor where her daughter used to play with fabric scraps while she worked. She did not shed a tear. She walked. Clara Thomas pulled up to the curb at 10:30 a.m. in a rusted silver sedan, the exhaust coughing in the cold air. Clara did not step out. She did not need to. Maeve placed her suitcase in the trunk. She got into the passenger seat. She closed the heavy door. Clara pulled into the flow of traffic. Maeve did not look back at the glass tower. She looked down at the sheepskin journal in her lap, its dark leather cover worn, its pages containing 31 years of a woman's hands, and the black and white photograph of her grandmother smiling in the cold Chicago sun. $412 to her name, no home, no vehicle, no child beside her, no line of credit, no employment record, no legal identity that the system recognized. He took the brand. He took the home. He took their daughter. He took 12 years of her creative life and dissolved them from every legal instrument in existence. He left her with a suitcase and an old book. He believed he had left her with nothing. Maeve lived in Clara's tiny apartment on Lake Street, sleeping on a thin cotton futon that smelled of damp plaster and old radiator steam. She watched the green CTA trains rattle past her window. Every 45 minutes, their steel wheels screeching against the frozen tracks in the dark. She had exactly $412.18 left in her pocket, and her daughter was miles away in a bedroom she could no longer enter. She did not complain. She woke up at 4:30 each morning to the smell of cold coffee and the persistent chill of a drafty living room. Her phone held 3 text messages from Maya, asking when she was coming home, and why her father said she was too busy to see her. Maeve stared at the glowing screen for 10 minutes, but could not find the words to explain a world governed by bank accounts and luxury deeds. She kept her silence. She put the phone face down on the raw floorboards and pulled her grandmother's sheepskin journal from her suitcase. The sheepskin cover was dry, but the pages inside still carried the faint, clean scent of Hattie's lavender starch and hot iron. On page 28, written in the winter of 1974, Maeve found the instructions for the structural blind stitch, a technique that allowed a hem to be raised without a single visible thread on either side of the fabric. In the margin, Hattie had written a small note in her careful blue ink: "Do not force the needle through the weave. Let the grain guide your hand." Maeve traced the ink with her thumb, feeling the faint indentation her grandmother's hand had made 52 years ago. She closed the journal. She divided her $412 on Clara's laminate kitchen table that afternoon. $75 went to a city sidewalk vendor permit from the Cook County clerk. $180 went to professional tailoring threads and measuring tools, and $92 went to a heavy, industrial-grade steam iron bought from a liquidating laundry shop on Pulaski Road. She had $65 left. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Maeve set up a borrowed wooden folding table outside a small laundromat on Chicago Avenue. She had no glossy signs, no decorative banners, and no corporate branding to catch the eyes of the commuters rushing toward the bus stops. She simply had her grandmother's steel shears, her industrial iron, plugged into an extension cord running through the laundromat's window, and a piece of cardboard with her prices written in black marker. Hems, $8. Structural alterations, $14. Zippers replaced, $10. For the first 3 hours, nobody stopped. People walked past with their heads bent against the wind, their eyes fixed on their shoes as they stepped over the gray slush on the sidewalk. Maeve stood behind the table, with her hands tucked into her woolen coat pockets, watching the steam rise from the laundromat's dryer vents. She waited. At 11:15 a.m., a woman stopped. She was in her late 50s, wearing a heavy, faded navy wool coat that had a deep, jagged tear along the back seam. She looked at Maeve's cardboard sign, then at the steel shears resting on the folding table. She asked if Maeve could repair the seam before her shift started at the nearby medical center. Maeve did not just patch the tear. She unpicked the damaged thread, laid the coat flat on her wooden table, and used Hattie's structural blind stitch to reconstruct the seam from the inside out. The thread disappeared completely into the weave of the navy wool, leaving the coat sitting as perfectly straight as the day it had been tailored. The woman touched the repaired seam with her fingers, her eyes widening as she searched for the stitch line. She paid $14. She asked for Maeve's name and promised to tell the other nurses on her floor. By the end of her second week, the numbers began to climb slowly. 12 garments in the first week, 26 in the second, and 48 by the middle of the third week. Maeve earned $340 in 20 days, which was not enough for a rental deposit on a new apartment, but it was enough to keep her steam iron running and her daughter's phone line active. She worked in the biting wind, her fingers turning red and stiff as she pinned delicate fabrics on the wooden table. She did not use a heater. She let her hands do the work, moving with the precise, rhythmic speed she had practiced since she was 12 years old. While Maeve stood on the concrete on Chicago Avenue, Julian sat in his temperature-controlled office at Sterling & Co. on the Magnificent Mile. He looked at the latest quarterly sales figures, which showed an 11% increase in revenue from their signature draped trench coats. He did not think about his ex-wife. In his mind, a woman with a suitcase and a leather journal was a closed file. He was wrong. Julian discovered her location on a Thursday afternoon, in her fourth week. He was driving his black Escalade through the West Side on his way to an investor meeting when he saw her. She was standing behind her wooden table, wearing her grandmother's coat, pin-fitting a gray tweed jacket for a postal worker who was waiting patiently in the cold. Her shears glinted in the winter sun. Her hands moved with an effortless authority that Julian recognized instantly. It was the same authority that had designed his entire spring line. He pulled his vehicle to the curb, but did not roll down his window. He watched her hand drape a piece of heavy fabric over the postal worker's shoulder, creating a clean architectural line without using a single pattern piece. He saw the small crowd of 7 people waiting in line behind her table. He drove away. He called Lawrence Vance before he reached the next intersection. 2 days later, at 10:45 a.m., 3 city code enforcement officers arrived at Maeve's table. They were accompanied by a private security guard wearing a uniform bearing the Sterling & Co. corporate logo. They presented her with a commercial violation notice, stating she was operating an unlicensed, non-conforming business on public property. They did not wait for her to pack her tools. They seized her wooden folding table, swept her professional threads into a gray plastic bin, and tossed her grandmother's rusted steel shears onto the wet asphalt. Maeve did not shout. She did not beg the officers to stop as they loaded her table into the back of their city truck. She knelt on the cold pavement, her knees soaking in the gray slush, and quietly retrieved her grandmother's steel shears from the curb. Julian stepped out of his vehicle, wearing a custom double-breasted camel hair coat and a pristine white silk scarf. He stood over her, looking down at her wet knees and her rusted shears. He spoke in his quiet, polite, corporate tone, his voice smooth and free of anger. He told her that her informal street operation was a public nuisance that degraded the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. He said it was standard protocol for the city to clear illegal vendors to protect licensed merchants. He told her that a woman of her caliber should focus on finding a stable, low-profile job rather than trying to play the designer in the dirt. Maeve stood up, wiping the cold gray slush from her knees. She held her grandmother's steel shears in her right hand, her grip steady and unyielding. She looked him directly in the eyes. "You can take the table, Julian," she said, her voice quiet and level in the freezing air. "But you can't buy the hand that made it." Julian did not answer. He turned and walked back to his vehicle, his polished shoes leaving clean tracks in the slush. The security guard drove the truck away, leaving Maeve standing on the empty sidewalk with nothing but her shears and her grandmother's sheepskin journal tucked safely inside her coat. She stood there for a long time, watching the gray exhaust from Julian's vehicle disappear into the cold Chicago sky. She did not cry. She walked back to Clara's apartment, her fingers frozen around the steel handles of her shears, knowing that the breaking point had finally arrived. Maeve did not stay in Clara's apartment for more than 48 hours after Julian cleared her sidewalk spot. She had two things in her hands: her grandmother's steel shears and the sheepskin journal. On Monday morning, Clara took her to see Marcus Vance, no relation to Julian's lawyer, a 62-year-old retired textile worker who owned an old, half-abandoned weaving mill on 51st Street in Bronzeville. The brick building had broken windows on the third floor, but the basement was dry, warm, and contained 4 functional electric looms from 1982. Marcus had worked with Hattie Jenkins in the late 70s, dye-vatting cotton and sourcing indigo from South Carolina. He remembered the blue ink recipes in Hattie's journal. He looked at Maeve's raw fingers and her rusted shears, then at the photograph of Hattie tucked inside the cover. He did not ask for a security deposit or a credit check. He offered her a 20-foot corner of the basement next to the boiler room for $150 a month, with access to the cutting tables and the steam lines. Maeve spent her first $50 of the week buying heavy linen canvas and black industrial thread from a liquidating warehouse near Midway Airport. She did not have the money to buy new sewing machines, but the news of her eviction on Chicago Avenue had already traveled through the local churches. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 retired seamstresses from Greater Mount Zion Church arrived at the basement. One brought a heavy, steel-cast white sewing machine from her attic, another brought a box of vintage horn buttons, and the third simply sat at the long table and began unpicking raw linen seams with her bare hands. They did not ask for wages or contracts. They worked because they had spent decades watching luxury brands buy their community's labor for pennies and sell it back to them in glossy catalogs they could never afford. They named the workspace Hattie's Loom, stenciling the words in gold paint over the heavy steel door facing 51st Street. The work began at 5 a.m. every morning. Maeve drafted the patterns directly on the fabric using a piece of white chalk, cutting each piece with the heavy steel shears without using a single digital projector or paper template. She launched a single, focused collection: 6 utilitarian trench coats made of heavy, indigo-dyed linen, structural shoulder lines that did not require metal pads, and deep hand-filled pockets that could hold a worker's tools or a mother's keys. She did not post them on high-end retail sites. Clara set up a simple business page on social media under the name Hattie's Loom, posting raw, unedited photographs of the seamstresses working under the yellow light of the basement. with the history of each garment detailed in short, factual sentences. Within 10 days, the page had 3,000 followers. By the third week, the followers climbed to 9,000, with orders arriving from independent boutiques in Portland, Brooklyn, and Chicago's Wicker Park. Helen Dubois, 48 years old, the senior fashion editor for Metropolitan Style magazine, discovered Hattie's loom through a photo shared by a local artist. She did not call ahead. She arrived at the basement on 51st Street on a rainy Thursday afternoon, her expensive leather boots clicking against the concrete stairs. She watched Maeve drape a heavy indigo sleeve over a wooden mannequin, her fingers moving with that calm, hypnotic precision that only comes from 20 years of daily practice. Helen touched the interior seams of the linen coat, searching for the stitch lines and finding none. It was the exact structural blind stitch that had made Sterling & Co. Has autumn collection the talk of the Gold Coast 6 months ago. Helen looked from the garment to the sheepskin journal open on the table, then to the photograph of Hattie Jenkins on the wall. She did not ask about aesthetic trends. She asked who had designed the patterns for Julian Sterling. Maeve looked at the editor, her voice steady and quiet. She said she had drafted every pattern for Sterling & Co. from her grandmother's journal for 12 years, but her signature had never appeared on a single corporate document. Helen Dubois did not just write a 2-page style feature. She saw a larger narrative, a story of structural exploitation, erasure, and a woman reclaiming her heritage from a luxury brand that had sought to render her penniless. The article grew from a small regional focus into an 8-page investigative piece titled "The Hand That Wove the Gold Coast, Maeve Jenkins and the Hidden Blueprint of Sterling & Co." Helen's team interviewed 3 young, black designers who had been fired by Julian after their graduation designs were integrated into the company's collections without compensation or credit. They had their original sketchbooks, dates, and termination emails. The evidence was systematic and undeniable. Julian received a draft of the article from Metropolitan Style's legal department 11 days before publication. He sat in his Gold Coast office, with the printed pages in his hand, his face turning gray as he read the testimonies of his former designers and his ex-wife. He called Lawrence Vance immediately, demanding a court injunction to block the publication. Vance drafted a fierce cease-and-desist letter, claiming that Maeve Jenkins was violating corporate non-disclosure agreements and utilizing proprietary design processes owned solely by Sterling & Co. The letter threatened a $5 million lawsuit against the magazine and Maeve if the article was published. This was Julian's ultimate mistake, the self-righteous gamble that would trigger his own undoing. The magazine's executive board did not back down. Instead of suppressing the piece, they moved it to the cover of the December issue, accompanied by a full-page portrait of Maeve standing in her basement workshop, holding her grandmother's steel shears, with the threat letter from Julian's lawyers printed in full on page 3. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Within 48 hours of publication, the Hattie's Loom social media page surged from 9,000 followers to 84,000. The video segment of the interview on the magazine's YouTube channel gathered 300,000 views in 3 days. People did not just see a clothing brand. They saw a battle between corporate arrogance and genuine human dignity. Maeve stood in her basement workshop on 51st Street, watching the orders flood the small laptop Clara had set up on the cutting table. She did not celebrate. She closed the laptop, picked up her chalk, and went back to the raw linen. The final custody and asset evaluation hearing was held at the Cook County Circuit Court on West Randolph Street on a freezing Wednesday morning in January. Judge Evelyn Carter presided over the courtroom. Maeve sat on the left side of the room, wearing a tailored navy blue wool dress she had made herself at Hattie's Loom. Julian sat on the right side with Lawrence Vance, his desk piled high with financial ledgers, corporate charts, and printouts of the recent media coverage. Vance argued with aggressive confidence, presenting the magazine cover as evidence of Maeve's thirst for publicity. He claimed that her media exposure made her an unstable and unsafe guardian for Maya, dragging a private family dispute into the national spotlight. He presented the tax records of Sterling and Co., showing a stable, multi-million-dollar corporate structure as the only logical home for their daughter. He did not mention that the publicity was entirely triggered by his own heavy-handed legal threats. Maeve's attorney, Simone Achibi, stood up second. She did not have a team of junior associates or a leather briefcase filled with corporate charts. She had a single manila folder containing the forensic audit of their marital assets over the past 16 months. She presented the mortgage refinancing documents Julian had brought home on that rainy Tuesday, proving that Maeve was never legally advised of the transfer of her home to Julian's Offshore LLC. She laid out the wire transfer records of $83,000 sent to the Cayman Islands bank account. She showed the systematic cancellation of Maeve's credit lines, executed while she was actively drafting the designs that funded those very accounts. On paper, Simone showed a calculated, domestic financial trap designed to render a mother legally invisible. The courtroom door opened, and Clara Thomas walked in, accompanied by a surprise witness, Julian's younger sister, Beatrice Sterling, 35 years old. Julian turned sharply in his chair, his face losing its color as Beatrice took the witness stand. Simone asked Beatrice to state her relationship to the petitioner. Beatrice testified that for the last 6 months, Julian had forced her to monitor Maeve's activities at Hattie's Loom and report back to his lawyers. She stated that Julian was the co-signer on her business loan for her boutique in Oak Park, and he had explicitly threatened to withdraw his name, forcing her into liquidation if she did not act as his informant. Beatrice testified that Julian had withdrawn his name anyway 3 weeks ago because she had refused to steal Maeve's draft patterns from the Bronzeville workshop. Her boutique had been forced into foreclosure. Beatrice presented 47 text messages detailing dates, times, and Julian's cold, calculated threats. Judge Carter read through the text messages slowly, her expression hardening with every page. She closed the folder with a sharp, echoing snap. The court finds that the father has engaged in a systematic pattern of coercive control, financial fraud, and third-party surveillance that is entirely detrimental to the child's well-being, the judge stated. Primary physical and legal custody of Maya is hereby transferred to the mother, effective immediately. The father's visitation rights are suspended pending a full psychological evaluation and a complete audit of his offshore assets. Julian sat frozen at his table as the judge called the next case. Maeve walked out of the courtroom, stood on the stone steps under the gray Chicago sky, and took out her phone. She called Clara's apartment where Maya was waiting. "You are coming home," she said. The legal filings became public record 48 hours later, and the consequences of Julian's actions cascaded with symmetrical precision. 2 of Sterling & Co. Largest international retail partners, reading the court's detailed findings on financial fraud and pattern theft, canceled their spring order contracts within 7 days, costing the company $4.2 million in projected revenue. It was not a coordinated boycott. It was simply a matter of risk management. Nobody wanted their luxury label associated with a man who used financial coercion against his own family. The department stores removed his draped trench coats from their premier window displays on the Magnificent Mile, replacing them with independent, ethically sourced designs. By March, Julian had to sell the Gold Coast penthouse to cover his mounting legal debts and corporate liabilities. Julian's romantic partner, a young marketing director named Evelyn, stopped returning his calls in November. She had known him as a wealthy, respected titan of the local fashion scene. When the public record revealed him as a man who used a shell company to strip his wife of her home while she slept, the illusion vanished. What he represented was gone, and she had no interest in the reality that remained. Julian ended up in a rented one-bedroom apartment in Cicero, facing a massive IRS audit of his Cayman accounts and a $47,000 bill from his own lawyers. He sat, alone in a kitchen he did not know how to use, looking at a dark television screen, realizing that the one thing he could never buy back was the creative hand that had built his name in the first place. The first evening, Maeve, Maya, and Clara stayed in the new brick brownstone on 47th Street was a Thursday in late October. Maeve had leased the property using the profits from Hattie's Loom's winter orders. She had set up her grandmother's old Singer machine by the dining room window, with 3 chairs arranged around the oak cutting table. Above the table, she had hung the framed black and white photograph of Hattie Jenkins, her hands holding the tape measure, smiling as if she had always known this day would come. Maya came into the room, her small hand touching the soft linen fabric draped over the chair. "Who is that, Mom?" she asked, pointing to the photograph. "That is the woman who taught me that dignity cannot be written on a piece of paper," Maeve said. They sat down together, the smell of warm starch and fresh linen filling the room, knowing they were finally home.